Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and all the other women who had followed Jesus since Galilee. They came at dawn on Sunday morning to properly bury the body of Jesus, who had been executed on Friday, but he had been quickly laid in Joseph's tomb before sundown. I'm sure these women hadn't slept as they waited for the end of the Sabbath at dawn on Sunday, because if they had slept, they would have only had nightmares. Just imagine the horrific violence they had just witnessed. So when morning finally came, these women were ready. But Rome had ordered everyone to stay away. They'd even posted soldiers to guard the tomb. Well, no soldier was going to be able to stop these women. They marched to the tomb full of grief, but also rebellion. I sometimes think when we visualize the women who went to the tomb, we might think of them as docile and meek and mild. But these were not subservient, submissive women. These were subversive women. Because for the sake of their loved one, they were not going to be timid, and they were determined to disobey the orders of soldiers if necessary. I think they're like the fearless and bold women throughout history who have fought for their communities and loved ones. For example, I can picture Gloria Richardson. During the civil rights movement, very few women were allowed to lead. They had to endure the similar scent of paternalism like the disciples who thought women were only telling fairy tales and nonsense about Jesus' resurrection. But Gloria was a force to be reckoned with. And she led the 60s movement in Cambridge, Maryland. And there's a famous, iconic photo of an officer pointing a bayonet at her. And I see the photo snapped just as she's pushing it away, walking past and giving him a look of disdain like, yeah, you just try it. And I can see her doing the same thing to a Roman soldier. Get out of my way. Or women like Prathia Hall, who worked for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She and her fellow SNCC workers were doing voter education in southeast Georgia in 1962. They were very much an unwelcome presence. She described one hazy day in the town of Sasser. While she and some freedom workers were walking down a dirt road, a pickup screeched to a halt in front of them. An extremely agitated man wearing a little tin badge with a bright red face jumped out of his truck and screamed at them, "I'm a deputy marshal. What are you doing here?" Prathia answered, "We're teaching people about voting." He began screaming curses at the top of his lungs until he was literally foaming at the mouth. Trembling with rage, he pulled out his gun and began firing at the ground around their feet. Eventually, the group was shoved into a little two-room jail, only a little larger than an outhouse, which, however, smelt just as bad. She said, "We didn't know if we would be eaten first by the rats and the monstrous bugs in this vermin-infested slime pit, or taken out in the dark of night and murdered in the woods." But there was nothing with which they could be charged, so after this intimidation, they were let go to go do their work again. Prathia and her colleagues knew that they were in danger just talking to people. In fact, the people they were trying to help often shooed them away because they didn't want any trouble. And did you know only a few churches were willing to allow movement workers to use their buildings for meetings? Because too many were burned down shortly after. It was dangerous, life-threatening work, and you think, why or how did anyone do it? Freedom faith, she called it. She was the daughter of a Baptist preacher, and she became one herself, one of the first women ordained by the Northern Baptists. She worked for SNCC for 3 more years and then enrolled in Princeton, where she earned her Master of Divinity, Master of Theology, and PhD. Freedom faith fueled and fired her fight. And the now Reverend Dr. Prathia Hall described how the power of her faith was expressed in songs and prayers of the movement, and it transcended the violent reality of our situation, she said. fashioning fear into faith, cringing into courage, despair into defiance, and pain into protest. In 2002, she said, "Even today, when I'm going through a storm, I breathe these hymns and prayers." Just like the women who witnessed the empty tomb. With their fear fashioned into faith and their pain into protest, they transcended the violent reality of their situation and experienced resurrection. Now, of all the difficult Christian beliefs to believe in, resurrection's right up there, right? But that's only if we focus on things like explaining the mechanics of it, or explaining things like whether or not it was literal. It's a belief I don't care if we believe in, or how it happened. But I do know it's still happening today. So one of the most inspiring stories I heard this Lent comes from First United Church of Oak Park, Illinois, a church that looks very much like ours, not the building, but the people. And in the tradition of giving something up for Lent, the church decided to give up whiteness, which meant abstaining from hymns and music composed by white people and only using music written by African American or non-white musicians from around the world. So outside the church, among the daffodils on the lawn, they put up a sign that said, "Fasting from whiteness." It was a small, symbolic gesture, but it's part of the church's broader anti-racist mission, meant to make people think. The pastor said the work of anti-racism in this country is to take whiteness out of the center so that other perspectives have space. It's not the hatred of white people. It's not forever banishing Bach and Beethoven. It was a limited time symbolic act of inclusion for all people. And then all hell broke loose. This benign and simple act was noticed by some in the national media. Online and cable news went apoplectic, apocalyptic. In the tradition of the red-faced marshal with his tin badge seen frothing at the mouth and trembling with anger, this church was seen as a serious threat to white supremacy. The church was slammed with hundreds of hateful and vulgar letters and emails and voicemails a day. Their website crashed. Threats were made against the pastor's life, and threats of violence against the church meant that while local and federal law enforcement could investigate, they had their Palm Sunday service online only until they could secure the church. Their Palm Sunday service was online because this group of people was too dangerous to gather together. 2022. Not 1962. This is last week. And the church members did have one complaint, but just one. Their message should have been bolder. Should have tried to do more. Well, resurrection is God's answer to that kind of hatred and violence. It's God's no to the powers of crucifixion. But resurrection wasn't accomplished on what we call Easter morning. Resurrection was begun. Resurrection was unleashed. You get that? Resurrection began that day. God didn't stop violence or grieving or suffering. God invites us to take the violence and grieving and suffering that happens every day and transform it. As Dr. Hall described it, to fashion fear into faith, cringing into courage, despair into defiance, and pain into protest. In fact, let's say that together. Fear into faith, cringing into courage, despair into defiance, pain into protest. And that's resurrection. It's resurrection whenever our church distributes food in the parking lot, like we will again on Tuesday, because people are still hungry. and God is still raising. It's resurrection whenever we raise money to help resettle refugees or provide disaster relief like we will today, because people are still suffering and God is still raising. It is resurrection when we march together in queer pride like we will finally be able to do again this summer, because transgender people are still being excluded, targeted, and even murdered, and God is still raising. It is resurrection whenever we furnish another apartment for women fleeing domestic violence, because people are still being abused and God is still raising. It is resurrection when we take food to the homes of our members in need, because we are community and God is still raising. It is resurrection whenever we have gathered to stand around a mosque to protect it from violence, and provided support for foster youth, and built a tower for low-income seniors, and so much more than I have time to get into, because there's work to do and God is still raising. And what does that have to do with us, if all that is God's work? Whenever we care for one another and engage in social justice or direct service, it is God still raising. Resurrection. Our acts of compassion and justice are rooted in this story, a story that refuses to die. A story that's been told on Easter mornings for 2,000 years. A story that doesn't allow hate to be the last word. It starts there. A story that doesn't end in despair. It simply starts there. So that's why we keep coming back, not as a rehearsal of the past, but a very present help in times of trouble. All who yearn for social justice need stories like this so we can remain vigilant and resilient. And we need a community because we need a place to root our work, because this work is hard and lifelong. These women, who were the first to witness the violence on Friday, were the first witnesses to the resurrection on Sunday. They were the first preachers of the gospel. They watched his rejection, betrayal, suffering, and crucifixion, just as he said, and then proclaimed the good news: he is risen. And Jesus still lives through his resurrected body. That's you, by the way. You are the resurrected body of Christ, the body of Christ in the world today, called to act with justice, called to love tenderly, called to serve one another, and called to walk humbly with our God.